We're joined on INSEAD Knowledge by Paddy Padmanabhan and another INSEAD professor, Pushan Dutt, talking about marketing implications in an economic crisis. You've brought out a paper, When to Push the Panic Button. When should you push the panic button in a crisis like this?
I think that's one of the things that we point out, which is the ability to figure out when you should push the panic button is contingent on your understanding how the crisis actually impacts consumers, how they spend, and realize that it's from that you can actually get a sense of what is the impact of a crisis on, say, sales or expenditures in a category. And that should basically then help you figure out, are you going to be really badly hit, in which case obviously you need to do things in a very different scale, versus are you going to be impacted but not as severely as some of the others, in which case the implications for you turn out to be quite different.
You've been looking at crises historically and seeing the impact on consumer confidence, and not surprisingly, consumer confidence takes a hit, retail sales fall, people stop spending. But it's not across the board though, is it?
One of the big differences that we find is we have to make these distinction between developed rich countries and developing countries. So we find that the hit that consumption takes, per capita consumption takes in developed country are smaller, whereas in developing countries is much larger. Plus the hit that it takes persists for much longer periods of time for developing countries as compared to developed countries. One of the reasons for this is that credit markets in developed countries are much better developed, whereas they're thin or missing in developing countries. So therefore, when a crisis hits, consumers actually lose access to financing, they lose access to borrowing. So therefore, what they do is they really cut back on their consumption expenditures, because they're also not aware of how long the crisis is going to last.
And people start saving money? I mean, essentially, they stop spending money or cut down on their expenditure, but they also start to save more, presumably for a rainy day.
It's not that in absolute amounts that their savings go up. The fraction of the income that they save, that goes up. Okay, so earlier they were saving, let's say, 20% of their income, but what happens when a crisis hits, especially in developing countries, they start saving a bigger fraction of their income and consuming a smaller fraction of their income. Consumers start saving a bigger fraction of their income and consuming a smaller fraction of their income in response to a crisis, which basically means it triggers a form of precautionary motive once a crisis hit. They become very precautionary, they become very slightly scared of what the future holds for them, and they start cutting back on their consumption and saving more for the future.
Just to make sure that they've got cash in hand in case anything happens. You look at different categories, you look at durable goods, non-durable services, basically find that, not surprisingly again, that people aren't spending on cars, large items, large ticket items, but they still have to spend on food. But in terms of services, they spend on education.
Basically what you have is, you can look at it this way, right? I as a consumer have $100 to spend, and I have to spend that across different categories. So one part of the paper, what we look at is how people split their consumption dollars across 4 basic categories. So the basic categories are non-durables, so food and things like that being non-durables. Then you have semi-durables, and then you have durable goods, and then you have services. So I can look at what your $100 was spent on before the crisis. And then I look at, okay, now what has happened to the split after the crisis? And that's where you start seeing interesting patterns. So for instance, consumption of durable, or the expenditures on durables, contract significantly, and they contract the most. Whereas consumption on non-food, it contracts, but it contracts a lot less. Consumptions on semi-durable and services also change a little bit. But the other interesting pattern that you see is that this also varies across different types of economies. So for instance, if you're in a developing economy, what you see is durable goods share actually goes down, and goes down remarkably. Non-durables share actually increases. Okay, and that's what happens in a developing economy, and the idea would be, things like food are a necessity. People still have to spend, and they will do that. And so the share relative to your income actually goes up. What is interesting is when you look at developed economies, food is a necessity, but what the data show is services are a necessity in those markets as well. So what you do find is share of durable goods going down, share of non-durables going up, but share of services also goes up. So in that sense, food would be, or non-durables would be a necessity in a developing economy, but non-durables and services are necessities in the developed economy.
So what are the implications then for managers who are basically trying to get through the current crisis?
See, there are a series of implications, right? I mean, one is in terms of trying to figure out how badly am I going to get hit. And here what we talked about in terms of the impact of different categories tells you, okay, now are you going to be more impacted? Are you going to be less impacted? If you're in durable goods, realize you're going to be impacted a lot more. Now, the other thing that you also have to realize is people are not just smoothing consumption across categories, they're also smoothing consumption within categories. So if I look at durable goods, yes, they do get impacted. But within durable goods, what you see is different subcategories get impacted more or less. So for instance, what you will see is things like cars, motorbikes, some of these big ticket items, they get impacted a lot more and a lot more adversely. By the same token, what you can see is even within the context of durable goods, people who are making things like bicycles actually benefit, because what people are doing is some of the dollars that you would have spent on automobiles or motorcycles, you now actually are now spending it towards more basic transportation. And so it is not the case that simply because on durables, everybody within durables is going to be impacted identically. Even within the categories, you can see that there are some sectors or some categories that are not going to be as severely affected, and there are some that are going to be more severely affected. So in that sense, when you look through the paper, what you can see is, automobiles, watch out, it's going to be harsh. Bicycles, it's not so bad.
If you are a manager, the first thing you have to ask yourself is what kind of country I am in. So for instance, within durables, we find that you get this switch between, you get the share of cars and motorbikes falling a lot, but in developing countries, you see that the share of audio-visual equipment like TVs, DVD players, cameras, all these things fall significantly. In developed countries, you don't see this. Okay, so again, you have to have a good idea of the local context that you're operating in. Okay,
and I mean, to build off on that, what this also tells you is, for a company, especially if it's global, you cannot have a one-size-fits-all approach to managing the crisis. You have to understand the category you're in, you have to understand the country you're in, and realize your strategies for coping with the crisis do need to reflect this divergence.
What advice would you have then for global companies?
The crisis is going to impact you very differently, even in the same category across different countries. The crisis, in terms of the impact it's going to have on your developing economy operations, are going to be more severe, and the downturn will be longer. In developed markets, you will be hit, but it won't be as severe, nor will it last as long. So in that sense, those are things you need to keep in mind in terms of figuring out not just how you manage through the crisis, but also how you figure out what to prioritize and what not to prioritize, and how to be a bit more smart about investing.
In your paper, you're also saying that managers need to understand whether products and categories are necessities or discretionary. Could you elaborate a bit further on that?
The way you would define something as a necessity or discretionary is you would look how responsive the demand for that product is to changes in income. If it is not very responsive to changes in income, then you would say that that is a necessity. Food would be an example. Whereas if it is very responsive to changes in income, so you get these, demand is very volatile once there are shifts in income, then you would say that that is a discretionary item. So what our research actually does is that it can actually identify how sensitive these categories are to changes in income. It's a measure called the income elasticity of demand. We can actually put a number to this across countries, and we can rank these categories as necessity versus discretionary. But there is a big caveat here. The big caveat is that all these numbers of elasticity, whether it is how sensitive demand is to changes in income or to changes in prices, sort of underestimate or overestimate how consumers will react. So what we find is, even when we control for changes in income and changes in prices, remember, changes in prices are coming in from managers' decisions. We find that consumers still smooth their consumption by reallocating their expenditure across various categories. Now, if you're not careful as a manager, you might misinterpret this as arising out of changes in your pricing decisions. So therefore, you might suddenly think that, okay, in my category, demand is very sensitive to changes in prices or sensitive to changes in income, but you would be actually underestimating or overestimating how sensitive demand is really to changes in prices. So what our methodology does is it allows us to estimate these things much more precisely and identify these independent effects, which simply comes out of consumers reacting by looking into the future and moving their expenditure shares around.
And that's, to build on that, that's key, because what it tells you is, if you just pay attention to income metrics or pricing metrics and try and make sense of what is happening to your sales, you're going to make mistakes. Because what we show is the crisis event in and of itself has an independent impact. And so if you don't correct for that accordingly, firms could make very, very bad decisions. You might create a price war where you don't need to.
Because that would be the temptation. A lot of companies will see a crisis like this and think, well, we just got to cut prices, make sure we keep the customer.
Right, and they would look at the prices and then the response of sales to those prices and infer that the market is a lot more price elastic than it actually is, because what they've done is made the mistake of taking the effect of a crisis and thinking it's due to the price changes, whereas it's not.
Your paper is talking about the impact of currency crises. How relevant is it in given today's crisis, which is essentially a banking credit crisis?
Crisis very broadly can be defined as banking crisis or a currency crisis. Currency crises are easier to measure. Getting data on exchange rates and exchange rate movements is much easier. So this is the reason why we focused on currency crisis. A banking crisis is slightly more tricky to measure. You need to look at bank runs, you need to look at reserve changes, you need to look at what the central bank is doing in terms of releasing liquidity, which is what the Federal Reserve is doing today. So measuring it is hard. However, you can think of both of these as these really negative shocks to a particular country. Both of them have been shown to have had similar impact on GDP, growth rates, but our paper looks only at currency crisis. Our hope is to actually extend this paper and extend it to the study of banking crisis as well.
So just to sum up then, as a professor of marketing, what would be your advice then in terms of how companies should approach a crisis like this?
See, one of the things we talk about in the paper is, if you are in a crisis, looking at just industry metrics is going to give you a very incomplete picture of what's going on. Market share is not a very good indicator in terms of crisis, partly because, as we show in the paper, realize the money that people are going to spend on your products is now not going to your competitor necessarily. It's going to a very different category. So from a marketing perspective, one of the things that firms have to do in a crisis situation is start getting a better handle of not their share of the market, but their share of the wallet, and start figuring out what is the consumer's wallet, what are they spending on in the crisis, how is the share of wallet now changing across brands, across categories, and that will give you a sense of how you might go about figuring out what you should be doing in a crisis. And the other thing is, again, something we talked about earlier, which is the share of market analysis that we conduct, that our data suggests is what's going on, is very different across countries. So if you look at the share of wallet pattern in, say, Hungary, it's going to look very different to the share of wallet pattern in, say, Vietnam or India.
right now we've been talking about the impact which is coming from consumer behavior. Now the recovery part seems to be determined a whole lot by how governments react to these crises. So if you look at the US today, they've had very expansionary monetary policies, and they're contemplating a very expansionary fiscal policy. Massive fiscal stimulus is coming through the US Congress right now. So we started looking at how does consumer expenditure and expenditure on these various categories recover, how fast do they recover in response to these fiscal policies, monetary policies, and a bunch of other things like the political system within which they operate, the countries, the legal system. So one of the things that we find is that fiscal policy gives you a boost, but it's a very short-term boost. Whereas monetary policy, the easing of credit, the increasing of money supply, which is what all governments today are contemplating, actually it helps speeden up the recovery process.
Pushan, Paddy, thanks for joining us on INSEAD Knowledge.